nationalist goals of Shia communities, not only in Saudi Arabia, but also Bahrain.
Ray, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I think there are two things that happen when people discuss Shiism, and they tend to equate sort of political expressions of Shiism with radicalism, which is no longer the case because, as you mentioned, that increasingly Shia political parties and activists began to see their empowerment coming through the electoral process, coming to franchise, and integration into their individual communities. Second of all is that Shia political parties and so on are necessarily, I think the subterranean messages that are anti-American. I'm not actually quite prepared to accept that. I mean, every camel should have a Shia chauvinist, and since Valley Nassism here, I suppose that's me. I think increasingly you began to see Shiism becoming a political status quo movement. And their empowerment is not necessarily, I think, something that should be disturbing to Americans. It might be disturbing to the Saudi elite. It might be disturbing to the Sunni elites of this region, but I don't think the Saudi elites' anxieties and sensitivities should govern our policy. And maybe it's good that Saudis are becoming a little more anxious and nervous. Maybe in terms of the domestic reforms of their own political society. In terms of Saudi textbooks still tend to vilify the Shiis in a very uncompromising way, while we tend to focus on the depictions of Christians and Jews and so forth. So if empowerment of Shiism compels the ruling elites towards some degree, Sunni ruling elites towards some degree of political modernization, I'm not quite sure if that's necessarily a bad thing. Second of all, we tend to view this particular movement as something that the United States can manipulate or control. It's just not beyond our manipulations or control. There will be a greater representation of the Shia community in Lebanon. Whether represented by Hezbollah, Amal, that's just the demographic reality of Lebanon. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a bad thing. The Saudi Shia population should remain disenfranchised and second class in Saudi Arabia for the stability of the Saudi society as a whole. In terms of Iraq, there will be inevitably a Shia empowerment, not in no way equates with the Iraqi Shia community being essentially, as I said, subsidiaries of Iran, but it may portend better relations between Iran and Iraq, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
What Toby was arguing was that what has happened as a result of the war, in the American war in Iraq, that whatever progress was being made for Shia in places like Saudi were set back because of the reaction. So you said, look, I mean, you could also, the American officials were arguing the opposite, which is, well, we worried about was stability, and so therefore human rights was frozen in these countries. So it sort of feels like, Toby, that you're arguing, you know, so you're damned if you do and you're damned if you do. If you do nothing, then hell, we've helped create the situation, and we go in, well, we've messed it all up, and they're going to react. And so you kind of wonder what's an appropriate policy. You wanted to speak of it. Was it toward that?
Well, no, I just wanted to take issue with the Ray's point that somehow a greater degree of Shia political power, Shia consciousness will somehow force Sunni elite into more political modernization. You just have to take a look at what they're doing to suggest that it's precisely the opposite. If you look at what the Bahrainis are doing through a whole informal and formal ways, they are doing to prevent the Shia from expressing themselves through either coercion or inviting Saudis to come to Bahrain, Sunni Saudis to come and become citizens and thus vote, to preventing the expression of al-Wafaq and its demands to open up the constitution, to things like in Lebanon, where there's going to be a very, very difficult battle that's already shaping up to alter the electoral process that will then allow the Shia to have more than the 21% of the seats that they have in the Lebanese legislature, as opposed to the 40% of the population that they supposedly represent.
So I actually want to talk about Lebanon, but I want to ask Toby to try to answer my question.
Yeah. It seems to me that sort of pursuing a Shia policy in the region is precisely the wrong way to proceed. Any kind of policy that attempts to empower the Shia community should address the ruling governments, and in the Gulf, those happen to be the Sunni monarchies, to deal with various complicated questions that both they and the United States have sort of collaborated in the past to make a problematic reality. So anti-Shiism, of course, is not necessarily a timeless, as I think Reza mentioned earlier, this is not this timeless product of Sunni Shia antagonism. In Saudi Arabia, you can argue that it is more so than elsewhere. But in fact, it's after 1979. This is a post-Khomeini phenomenon where anti-Shiism is politicized. And it's justified and rationalized as a way to fight the anti-Soviet, anti-Iran jihad in Afghanistan, as well as contain Khomeini in the Gulf. So that exists, and in a way you have to deal with it. So the U.S. has to realize that. But appearing to cater to or to appeal specifically to a Shia audience will basically serve those interests in the end. I mean, sort of the anti-Shia forces that exist and have existed in the past will simply remobilize. So the appropriate policy, I think, means that you continue to focus and talk to the El Saud and the El Khalifa about reform and political issues, which once resolved then ultimately allow for a level playing field. And that's tough, especially in Saudi Arabia. But the consequences of doing otherwise, and I think it speaks to Ray's point about, and I actually think there's more of a potential problem in marginalizing, making the Saudis uncomfortable with their Shia community. And the pitfall of not then dealing with the Saudis on a host of other related issues is this: that if the Saudis become uncomfortable with the Shia and they become uncomfortable with Iraq, the thing that they're going to do is they're going to open the faucet of jihadism, and they're going to let the
war.
Well, I mean, arguably the Saudis don't have an interest in pursuing that anymore. I mean, they have a domestic problem that they've tried to contain. But what they can do, and what they've done in the past, is simply allow these anti-Shia Takfiri, ideologues to become more prominent in society and community. That can, sort of, this has powerful mobilizing potential. I mean, it creates a series of problems, and the Saudis realize that they can counter in a more interventionist American policy that appeals to the Shia community. The Shia live in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, which is where all the oil is. So strategically, this is of huge concern to the U.S. and how they handle it. So it's a sensitive issue, and I think that as when I was with ICG, we argued that all of this has to be contextualized within a larger push, pressure for reform, for political reform. Democratization may not be the right way to go, but some kind of political reform that levels the playing field.
Steve, talk a little bit about Lebanon, about how the rise of Hezbollah, of Shiism, is serving or not American interests there.
Well, certainly, first, broader context, Hezbollah obviously is an organization, not the only Shia organization in Lebanon, and has a long history dating back to the late 1970s, early 1980s. Hezbollah itself is a malevolent extremist organization despite its vast array of social services and the fact that Hezbollah representatives have acted responsibly in the Lebanese parliament. The question is now, how does the rise of Shia power in Iraq and consciousness in other places affect the Lebanese? And I think that it's actually paradoxical. Hezbollah and the Shia are certainly feeling their certain buoyancy from these developments, but at the same time they're limited in what they can do. And you can only just look back to the mass demonstrations after Rafi Hariri's assassination in Lebanon, where Hezbollah could not come out brandishing Hezbollah flags. They were forced to strike a nationalist tone.
They did it both.
Okay, but by and large, this was they were signaling to the rest of the Lebanese population that they were interested in Lebanon and Lebanon's well-being. And they were not necessarily at the direction of either the Syrians or the Iranians, despite what many people believe. And so at the same, so they're kind of hindered in certain ways. They're now constrained by this renewed kind of Lebanese nationalism, this unintended consequence of Rafi Hariri's assassination. But at the same time, they demonstrate a lot of power. When the new government floated the idea of referring the Hariri assassination to International Criminal Court, Hezbollah representatives and the Amal representatives walked out and created a governmental crisis, and then the Lebanese prime minister had to give in. This is a similar kind of debate that's going to be going on with regard to disarming Hezbollah, and that's why it's so important that the Sheba farms be considered occupied by the Israelis, so that Hezbollah remains a resistance organization. Because their arms, it's not so much Israeli occupation of Sheba, whether Sheba is part of the Golan Heights or Lebanon, but Hezbollah arms are now seen in the current constellation of Lebanese politics as the great equalizer. They don't have the political power. They may have demographic weight on their hands, but because of the way the electoral institutions are set up in Lebanon, they have no way of cracking open this system in a way so that these arms are really the power in which they're able to leverage the political system.
But do you feel that their role in government has moderated them?
They have acted responsibly as members of the government and in the legislature, which they sat since the mid-1990s. But it's saying, what do we mean by moderated? I mean, if you watch El Manar television, you can't possibly believe that this group has moderated. So it's really, you take a look at what's happening in the suburbs of Beirut and the extension of social services. It's the same kind of Islamist story that you find throughout the region. So it's double-edged.
I want to go to the audience, but I want to ask Ray one question first, and that is, do you think that Iran and the United States are eventually going to have to cooperate seriously on Iraq? And if so, will that serve everyone's interest by somehow forcing the United States to negotiate with the country and also forcing Iran to sort of play some realistic role?
I think the level of mistrust between the two countries is such great that I'm not quite sure if they can actually cooperate, because we tend to see projections of Iranian influence as necessarily a bad thing, while obviously Iranians view continued American presence as detrimental to their interests. So there's a legacy of mistrust here that I think could preclude a more pragmatic cooperation on areas of common interest. Particularly as Iraq gets its own sea legs and there's a unitary government and moving on. I mean, at this point, the Iranian interest is for several things. For Iraq to remain territorially intact, is to have a continued democratic process, because that tends to empower the Shia community, and for eventual departure of the American forces. The way you can achieve all those is some degree of stability in Iraq. And so in that sense, there is some degree of common interest, but the level of mistrust between the two countries is just the legacy of mistrust.
But do you think Iran wants Iraq to maintain a certain level of chaos at the moment in order to make it more difficult for the United States? Do you think they want to actually stabilize the situation in order to help ease the United States out?
It's a tough balancing. It's a lot of contradictions and paradoxes.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you want Americans out. That requires some degree of stability. At the same time, you want a type of society created in Iraq where there's a federal structure, weak central government with strong provinces, because weak central governments historically do not have strong central armies. So you don't want Iraq to once again emerge as a potential barrier to your influence. So there's a lot of difficult balancing acts. Now, Iranians are pretty good at balancing different set of interests, but I think their foremost concern is for eventual departure of the American forces. And that requires, as I said, some degree of stability.
Either of you want to address that before I turn to the audience?
Let me go to the question.
Okay, so I think we have a half an hour or so, and would welcome your questions, Joe, and please tell us who you are.
Hi, Joe Klein from Time Magazine. I'm really interested about Iran, and especially President Ahmadinejad. And I'd be curious about your views about his impact on the Iranian establishment, number one, and number two, and far more importantly, whether his relationship with the Revolutionary Guard Corps will have any impact on the balance of power within Iran, and also what impact it'll have on the activities of the Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah in the rest of the region.
The Iranian president sort of represents a generation, a younger generation of conservatives who are austere, rather isolationist, because they grew up in a state that was largely isolated from the West. And so they have very different perceptions. Where he stands in terms of this political system, I always said during the reformist era that the notion that the Iranian president was irrelevant was flawed and wrong. I say it today, the notion that Iranian president is powerless and irrelevant is flawed and wrong. And he has a seat at the table. He represents a constituency. He represents a movement. He has, as you said, close association with the Revolutionary Guards, Basij, and the security services. So his point of view cannot be disregarded. Now, it may not prevail in this coalition government that constitutes the Islamic Republic of Iran, but it has to be taken into consideration. And he does have a voice in terms of shaping the context of Iranian policies, in some ways the content of it. In terms of Iran's policy toward Afghanistan and Iraq, I think you were asking, those are always in the hands of the Ministry of Intelligence and the Revolutionary Guards, the Quds Brigade of the Revolutionary Guards. So they're very, I mean, even the current Iranian ambassador to Iraq has a Revolutionary Guard background. So they run out of those two particular organizations, obviously with oversee and supervision by the political authorities. But operationally, day-to-day wise, they tend to be more in charge.